So I remember in 2008, I met Ernest Munoz at the World Economic Forum. He wasn't yet Energy Secretary for the United States. At the time, he was a physics professor at MIT. And we had a conversation about climate change and renewables and ramping this up. And I was saying, well, what about the technologies and storage and batteries? And he said, no. Technology is not the constraint. The constraint is politics. Now, politics is a bit like the love life of an elephant. It all happens at a very high level. A lot of dust is raised, and you have to wait years to see any results. So really what this panel is about after Paris, it did take many years to be fair, what more do we need from politicians? And and regulators. I have on my panel three great speakers: Michael Lewis, Chief Executive of E.ON Climate and Renewables; Bill Vail, Director of Sustainability at Facebook; and Dana Younger, Chief Renewable Energy Specialist at the International Finance Corporation. Now, Mike, let me start with you. You're a Welshman, like my husband, and you're based in my country, in Germany. You coach rugby in a football nation. That must be a little bit like pushing renewables at a utility.
That's tough.
For a long time, renewables were a niche and not really a mainstream thing at E.ON. It's becoming more so. You were slow to change, but you are changing. What can governments, your government and EU governments and really regulators across the world do to make your life easier to ramp it up?
Before I answer that question, just one point. I think it's fair to say E.ON was slower than we would have liked to have been with hindsight, but it's not true to say we were slow. We actually started investing big time in renewables nearly 10 years ago, and we've invested more in renewables in the last 10 years than any other technology, and that's why we're now number 2 in offshore wind and number 12 in onshore wind globally. The problem is we didn't invest much in Germany, so it isn't well known that we actually have a very large renewables business, principally outside of Germany. Nevertheless,
it's interesting in itself, because Germany was kind of a frontier country.
Indeed, but the reason for that was very straightforward. We decided from the very beginning that we wanted to invest where the natural resources were best, and that meant going to the windy regions of the world. That meant other parts of Northern Europe, so in the UK, in Scotland, and offshore, and in the US, in Texas, where we have very, very high load factors. And that gave us the ability to drive down the cost of renewable energy, which was always our ambition, not to rely on subsidies ultimately. And that's why we deliberately chose to invest in the best wind resource regions, not in the regions where we got the best subsidies. And that was very important. And of course, a lot of German projects have very low load factors. But offshore is a good region in Germany, and that's why we have our main investments offshore in Germany. But coming back to the policy point, I think there are three things we need from policymakers, and a number of them have been mentioned already this morning, but good arguments are always worth repeating. First thing is we need stability. We need a policy to be put in place that then gives us a long-term perspective. We're putting several billion euros into the ground every year in renewable energy. We need to rely on the fact that the policy will be consistent over time and that we will be able to get a return on that investment. Second thing we need is a market-based mechanism. And what we've seen in Europe is a move towards tendering-based systems. This is to be welcomed. It's driving down the cost of renewables, as we've seen in the recent tendering processes offshore. It's starting to happen onshore as well. And in the US, we've seen it with the PPA system, which complements, of course, the production tax credit, but it is a market-based mechanism in terms of giving a longer-term fixed price, which is competitive. So those two things are critical: market-based, long-term, and also consistency. So where you have a single market in Europe, where you have the ability to move electricity between geographies, you need consistencies in policy. Otherwise, you get distortions and you get investment going to the wrong place, and the best projects aren't built. Rather, projects that are subsidized more heavily are built. And that's not good for consumers, it's not good for companies, and it's not ultimately good for society.
Bill, let me come to you next. I'll come to you at the end, Dana, just to sort of cover Europe going to the US. Facebook and other companies aren't just waiting around for governments and regulators to get their act together. You're doing a lot of things on your own accord. you in particular, you as a company, have committed to various things, including, I think, sourcing 50% of the energy in your data centers by 2018 from renewable energy. Be interesting to hear if you're on track for that. And also, it's all open source. You're trying to push other companies along. Do you feel that companies can actually get a lot done without policy, or how important are the regulators, and are you pushing them too?
So the short answer is yes and yes.
Did you get that?
So we're committed to powering our infrastructure and connectivity, which is the business we're in. For anyone who doesn't know what Facebook does, talk to me later. We're committed to powering connectivity with the smallest footprint we can. And so we work really hard on energy efficiency, but we still use a lot of energy. And so we have spent the last several years figuring out how we can get more renewables into our energy portfolio. We set a goal of 25% in 2015 coming from renewables. We hit 35. We then set a goal of 50% in 2018. I think we're on track. It's a stretch goal. It's not a slam dunk, but check back with us in 2018. When we get to 2018, we'll set another goal. We're stair-stepping our way toward 100%. What we really need is market access to renewables. So in some places, that's very hard. And so then we have to get creative, and we have very smart people on our energy team who are creative, and it takes a lot of work. I think with policies that really open up the market for customers like us and other customers, then it gets easier and more companies will be able to do it in more places. But we are finding solutions, whether it's direct, long-term power purchase agreements in places where we've got the regulatory ability to do that, or virtual PPAs in places where we don't. We start generally by working with our utilities and trying to find solutions that will work for them and for us and for other ratepayers. We don't want to be subsidized by other ratepayers. We want to do this in a way that is, where we're paying a fair price. But we also don't want to pay a premium if we don't have to. And in many cases today, with the cost of wind and solar, we shouldn't need to pay a premium. They aren't inherently more expensive. And so we'd like to get, at a reasonable, fair cost, paying what it costs to deliver that energy, we'd like to get clean energy into our facilities.
Dana, in some ways, the elephant in the room is kind of the developing world, where 1.2 billion people are still looking for access to energy, and China is the biggest renewable producer in the entire world. We're not talking about it enough probably here. And one of the interesting things coming from you is how you kind of, well, first of all, how these countries are dealing with the challenge of ramping up renewables, and then also how they're dealing with sort of conflicting policy aims like poverty alleviation, and how you marry the two.
Thank you. I think it's really a fascinating point in the evolution of the global renewable energy market and the scaling up. We have, on the one hand, these very large country markets like China and India. India, some people forget, was actually a very early adopter, for example, in wind. They had 6 gigawatts in the ground before China even had any kind of substantial wind program going. But now they're playing catch up in the solar area, and Prime Minister Modi has really done a lot to accelerate their ambitions there, and we're participating quite a bit in financing many of the companies in India that are among the leaders. In fact, one of our investee companies just listed on NASDAQ for an IPO within the last few weeks. Then, in addition to these large players, the BRICS, you've got countries like Turkey, Mexico, where many of the companies who are represented here are active. We've been involved in financing projects, for example, with Acciona and EDF Energy Nouvelle in Mexico. We're working with many other of the companies represented here, Aqua Power, for example, on CSP projects in places like Morocco and South Africa. And so you have these very large markets, but then you have the challenge of kind of spreading renewables into the many other countries within these regions. And so you have a lot of new markets opening up, and whether that's places like Vietnam and Myanmar in Southeast Asia, or some of the countries in Central Asia, many countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, outside of the larger countries like South Africa, which clearly moved out to a big lead. with their program over the last several years. But there's also this challenge in terms of how to go about doing it. Do you use feed-in tariffs or renewable portfolio standards, or do you go the auction route? And we've actually had kind of an interesting set of experiences here, because if you go back long enough, you've seen things like the NAFO program in the UK that really started out with kind of the reverse auction method and actually functioned very poorly. And then you had the German experience kind of demonstrating that feed-in tariffs are really one of the quickest ways to drive renewables into markets. So I think there's been, in the emerging markets, a focus initially more on feed-in tariffs and renewable energy portfolio standards to achieve that goal. But now you're really seeing a major push into kind of the use of auctions increasingly recently in countries like Argentina, where IFC and the World Bank were involved in helping to stand up the Renovar program, which has just issued its first results and is having a 1.5 and a second round coming up quite soon. In Mexico, where you've already had 2 rounds of auctions, we also have put together some programs for some of these newer markets, most notable being the Scaling Solar program, where we had an auction in Zambia for 2 roughly 50 megawatt projects. One was won by a French company, Neon, working with First Solar from the US, and the other won by Enel Green Power. Mr. Storaci was here on the panel yesterday. So this is very exciting that we can move the market through these kinds of mechanisms. We also continue to work with other companies in selected countries in sub-Saharan Africa, smaller markets like the Middle East, countries like Jordan, where historically a lot of companies would tell us we're not really interested in addressing markets that are smaller than 500 megawatts because we just don't see the economics. But we've actually seen the development of a lot of capacity through smaller companies. So we did, for example, a transaction in Jordan recently called the Seven Sisters, which kind of vacuumed up a number of smaller developers. It represented over 50 megawatts of capacity in the end, but we had sort of common terms so that, you know, the transaction could be streamlined, and it was quite a success. So we're seeing a shift now in the market, some new countries continuing to use feed-in tariffs, others beginning to move to auctions. And when you come to the last piece that you mentioned, the energy access question, dilemma, that's another...
Well, and just to sort of reinforce that question, you know, Jeffrey Sachs just gave a lecture actually in New York a couple of days ago, and he talked a lot about climate fairness and this idea that, you know, as we ramp up renewables rightly, and have to even more so in the developed world, should we let the developing world continue burning some fossil fuels?
Mm-hmm.
Or one counter argument might be, do we really just need to help them ramp up the renewables right from the start in order to not cause the same problems that some of the older utilities face here in terms of managing, you know, capacities and old assets and so on? I mean, to what extent should we continue burning fossil fuels in and build new capacity in that field, or just move to renewables straight away?
Yeah. Well, this is another really fascinating topic that could absorb a lot of time, and I know our time is very brief. But the first issue you face in a lot of the developing world, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, is the fact that the grids are very weak, typically. There's large issues in terms of institutional capacity among the utilities, lack of bankable off-takers. So there are some fundamental market barriers that are preventing making any kind of improvements in the basic electricity generation, transmission, and distribution systems, irrespective of what the fuel source or the technology used might be. Clearly, in a lot of these systems, there still is a need for thermal baseload capacity, either existing capacity to be maintained, refurbished, and expanded in many cases. But there's also a huge role for renewables. And in sub-Saharan Africa, really the underexploited potential, and I've actually had this argument a bit with Jeffrey Sachs, where he was pushing kind of a solar-only solution for Africa, is hydroelectric capacity. The continent has got massive undeveloped hydro capacity, and we've been involved in putting together projects like Bujagali in Uganda, which is actually exporting power to some of its neighboring countries, and you have a history of this in other regions within Africa. Coming to the other piece of the equation, the unelectrified populations and the energy access topic, that's also a very difficult topic. Countries like Nigeria have basically just said, we recognize that we're unable to serve, this is the Ministry of Power saying, we're unable to serve all the unelectrified population within our country. And they're having difficulty just maintaining service to the urbanized population that's already connected, reliable service. So that then opens up the issue of, well, how do you address these unserved populations? And that's where I think some of the most exciting work is going on right now in the electricity field. And many of the leading European players are beginning to make small investments alongside venture capital and other parties to begin to populate this new ecosystem of off-grid solar mini-grids and solar home systems and implementing a number of other types of exciting
We
solutions.
should have another session on just that topic in the next Energy for Tomorrow conference. Mike, briefly back to this whole government section. I know that you just got your German passport.
Okay.
Congratulations. Because your country, of course, is leaving the European Union. Now, we've talked about this before on this stage, and I'm just curious, in terms of the issue of policy and the importance of frameworks and so on, are you worried about Brexit kind of messing with what you've got?
Well, it remains to be seen, because we don't really know at this stage what Brexit means, especially after the court
Brexit
ruling.
means Brexit.
Well, yeah, quite. But yeah, I mean, the fundamental problem is the uncertainty it causes. We simply don't know what the future relationship will be. We don't know what the respective policies will be in relation to energy between the EU and the UK. So a cloud of uncertainty has descended, and uncertainty in our business is a bad thing, full stop. Simply because, as I said before, we have long payback times, large capital investments, and above all, you want clarity and consistency and a long-term perspective. So inevitably, that causes uncertainty, the whole Brexit situation. So I can't really comment on what the effects will be. It's simply unknowable. A couple of things I would say, though, is I think it's critically important, as I said before when we talked about policy frameworks, that where you have contiguous geographical entities, where there is a flow of energy between the two, that you have consistent policies. So it's important that the UK does continue to contribute to overall European energy policy, and that the renewable energy resources we have in the UK, which are extensive, both on and offshore wind, are part of the overall European solution to the problem of CO2 and reaching the Paris COP targets. So it's critically important that whatever comes out of it, we don't see any kind of cleavage between UK policy and European policy.
There's, of course, that other uncertainty next Tuesday. Bill, I'm going to throw this open to questions in a minute, but I want to talk about something really important, I think, in terms of Facebook. Now, Facebook has such leverage in the world in terms of reaching people, let's put it that way. Now, you have an algorithm that sort of chooses to send bits of information, articles. You basically curate content, the algorithm does, and sends people stuff that interests them based on their track record. Now, if you are a climate skeptic and you don't believe in climate change and you read that sort of stuff, you're likely to be sent more of that stuff. It's the famous filter bubble problem. I mean, to the extent that Facebook's algorithm reinforces that, there is surely a sort of a responsibility if, as a company, which you clearly have in your mission statements and in your commitments, if you believe that this is an important issue that needs addressing and consumer choices are obviously key, then should you change your algorithm in order to educate people about climate change?
That's a very dangerous slippery slope to start to go down in terms of imposing our views on what people see.
But even that language suggests that it is a view rather than a fact. So, you know, this is not a political issue, arguably. This is not propaganda. This is science. So
right. So belief in climate change is science, and we believe in climate change, and we are committed to working on it because it poses a threat to our future business, it poses a threat to the global economy. The question of what the right solutions are is a technical issue, it's a political issue, it's an economic issue, it's not just fact. We have to be very careful, and we are very careful, not to bias what you see in your newsfeed based on what we think the most important issues of the day are, or what our beliefs are about the right answers to those, but rather based on what you think is important, what your friends think is important, and so on. I think the filter bubble question is perhaps a bit overrated. Certainly in my own newsfeed, I actually probably see a wider range of opinions than I get in my day-to-day interactions with people. I am friends with people on Facebook across the political spectrum. We tend not to have, I don't necessarily interact with them day-to-day, face-to-face, so we tend not to have those political discussions. But on Facebook, I see what they're posting. We engage in discussions back and forth. It opens up my mind a bit to other points of view, and I think hopefully I open theirs a bit. Some of them maybe not, hard to say. But I think the thing that we do try to do is make our platform useful and usable by organizations that have a mission to educate people about using renewables, about the reality of climate change, about the solutions to climate change.
So here's the problem coming from the New York Times. I mean, I'm told by people who do the research on our readership, it is very difficult to get people reading articles about climate change. I mean, I talked to Adam, who's the editor of this conference, and he used to be climate change editor and knows this stuff well. And he said that millennials are incredibly interested in the subject; they're fascinated by it, but they don't want to read about it. And if you look at the type of readers who click on our stories, it's basically majority men, and I think older men. I mean, it's sort of weird, kind of like you guys here, but. Anyways,
You're welcome.
I want to take up all the time, but I think I just wanted to bring this up and be interested if there's a reaction in the audience. I think filter bubble is actually crucially important, and getting information to people and awareness in the age of post-truth politics, I think, is essential. But yeah.
I think in the modern world, I don't want to get into politics here too much and so on, but I certainly personally, I think that we do have an issue that things have become more politicized. In some cases, many issues have. Things have become more partisan. People have moved farther apart. In the US 30, 40 years ago, the parties overlapped much more, and each party was a much bigger tent than it is today. So I think there is a filter bubble of a sort in society. We can debate how much online media and Facebook and others have contributed to that. I think that's an issue. It's not just an issue for climate, it's an issue on many issues.
I agree.
Right?
I agree.
If I could just very quickly, I want to pick up on something that actually both of you said. One of the big issues for renewables in many places is the how do you get these projects financed? How do you get them built? And so there's lots of people worry about policy to speed things up, to provide incentives, and so on. People worry about making sure we've got financing available. One of the things that helps with that is demand. And renewable portfolio standards, feed-in tariffs, and so on are one way to ensure that projects actually can get built because there's a clear market. Another way, today especially, I think there's been a tipping point in the market in the last few years as the cost of wind and solar have reached cheaper than fossil and cheaper than coal in some places. It now makes sense for a company like ours and now hundreds of others to say, we're going to buy renewables, not just because it's good for the world, but because it's actually good for our business. And that is now becoming a significant driver of demand.
Yeah.
And when we see that in the volume of corporate PPAs is growing exponentially.
Right. Last year in the US, the corporate PPAs accounted for more than half of the wind market.
Yeah. No, let me throw this open. We haven't got much time. I'll just steal 3 minutes. Can I? Okay, go for it. There's a lady there.
Yeah, hello. Now we know that Costa Rica has been running for almost 2 months only in renewable energies, but sadly we know that's not the case all the time and clearly not everywhere. So when the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing, we need to have a backup storage. We need to have energy ready to be available. So for those countries that have the luck to have hydropower, they use hydro. For those that not, they are using gas plants and coal plants. Now we have been listening about a future running only on renewable energy. So I'm wondering what is going to be the technology that is going to allow those countries that don't have hydropower to be able to comply with the International Energy Agency requirement of 90 days of energy storage to be ready.
Dana, or maybe Mike. Yeah, go on.
You just,
Both.
I mean, I think the dream of 100% renewables is certainly, it will be achievable at some point. We're not there yet. That's very clear. And we can't run the system on renewables. And that's why when we split E.ON into two companies, one dealing with system security, Uniper, centralized generation, is very much about tackling that market of keeping the system stable. Another company, E.ON, dealing with customers, the new world, and renewables. Those two will exist together for some time until there is a storage solution which can not only solve short-term frequency response issues, but long-term seasonal issues as well. So it's coming, but it's a transition. Whether that transition takes 5, 10, 15, 20 years, nobody knows. It depends on how quickly the storage technologies develop. But it's happening very quickly. And if past is anything to go by, the speed at which wind and solar adapted and became cheap, if that's any guide, it will happen much quicker than people think.
Let me get quickly to another question. There we go, another lady.
I have a question to Dana Younger. You mentioned the scaling solar program, and you mentioned that you developed it in Zambia. What characteristic of the country made you choose Zambia over other sub-Saharan African country? And are you planning to extend the program to other countries?
Yeah, thanks. There were a number of factors that enabled Zambia to kind of be the first country to roll this out. And first and most importantly, we were working closely already with the government, and they were quite open to this idea. So this was very clearly a pilot. We evaluated a number of countries and in the end selected Zambia. We've already signed agreements with 2 other countries in sub-Saharan Africa, Senegal, and there's actually pre-qualifications that were issued recently, and so that is moving now quite rapidly. And then also Madagascar is the other sub-Saharan African country that's announced. But we're negotiating, and I should mention here, this is an initiative of the World Bank Group, so both the World Bank is involved and IFC, both. And within IFC, it's our advisory services area, as well as the investment side after winners are selected, potentially, although that's not an obligation on the winning bidders. I should note that also there's been quite a bit of interest in spreading this model to other countries in the world, so there's also discussions underway now with a number of countries in Asia and other geographies about the program architecture.
So okay, very quickly, because you look so eager.
So my question is to Mr. Whale. Following Katrin's reasoning, would it be conceivable that one day, just like we can report on Facebook racist content or sexual content as inappropriate, we would be able to report climate change denial as inappropriate content?
Very good question.
So I'm not on the product side. You know, I think, again, I would hesitate to call it a single issue. I think climate is extremely important. It's the issue of the day, the environmental issue. It's existential. I think that being able to flag factually incorrect content could be useful. The question is that a feature that would be that people would find valuable and in the end actually begin to change people's behavior and so on? I don't know. It's something that I think would be worth thinking about. Love to see some experiments with something like that.
So the bad news is we're out of time, but the good news is you can corner these guys in the coffee break. Also, there is going to be a short presentation on the state of the planet by a leading scientist called Johan Rockström. So I do encourage you to listen, and thank you very much.
We're